The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, what is Ontario's nursing shortage costing the province? Then, Steve Paikin speaks to former astronaut and retired cabinet minister Marc Garneau about his life in space and politics. That's next on The Agenda. Nursing is a critical part of our healthcare system, but retaining and attracting nurses to the profession is becoming a huge burden. Joining us now on what this nursing shortage is costing the province and potential solutions, we welcome on the line from Montreal, Charlene Stewart, International Canadian Vice President at SEIU Healthcare. And with us in studio, Sandra Carroll, Vice Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences and Executive Director of the School of Nursing at McMaster University. Lamo Dalkar, President of the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario, or RNAO, and a primary care nurse practitioner. And Rosalie Wanch, Senior Policy Analyst with the C.D. Howe Institute. Welcome everyone in studio and of course on the line. I'm going to set up the table first. As we know, not all nurses are employed in hospitals. Some are employed by staffing agencies. And in recent years, those wages look different. So I'm going to direct your eyes to the screens over there. According to the Government of Canada Job Bank in 2023, the median wage for a registered nurse in Ontario was $38.05 per hour. In December 2023, the Auditor General released a report on emergency departments that found agency nurses in hospitals were paid more than $75 per hour, with some higher rates in Northern Ontario. And in July of last year, the Ontario Nurses Association asked hospitals to submit data from 2022, and it shared it with the Globe and Mail to show that there were more than 1 million total reported hours worked by agencies in hospitals. And they charged on average, not median, wage of $140 per hour, with a total bill of more than $168 million in the reported time. All right. On one hand, nurses and staffing agencies are getting paid more. That's a good thing. People are getting paid for the work they do. On the other hand, it seems to be costing hospitals much more. So I'm going to start with Lamo. What are we supposed to do here?
So I think the problem is much deeper than just a cost reimbursement for agency nurses in work settings, because we have to look at the agencies have always been there for decades. Having said that, the price, the steep price hike that we see has been because of the nursing shortage crisis that has been more highlighted more so since COVID. On top of that, Bill 124 was another damper where it did have a significant negative impact on the nursing morale, and of course the work plus the workload and the high burnout rates was enough for nurses to think about exiting the profession in total, which led us to a huge nursing shortage crisis. That also gave rise to a lot of agency nurses being utilized and hence the steep cost. So if you are going to look at agency nurses were charging $75 an hour, and now you have $140 to $250, if you can see some of the reports up north, $250 an hour, which is in general a huge healthcare cost, because this is our taxpayer money that we are paying to these private agencies to deliver care. And these nurses are one of our own. So it's a bigger problem. The cost is just the tip of the iceberg.
All right, Rosalie, I'm going to get you to respond as well.
Yeah, well, I've got maybe a bit of a different perspective, because it certainly is true that we do have a shortage of nurses, particularly in some care settings. However, when you actually look at the overall labor stats, employment in healthcare has actually grown more than the rest of the economy. Even when wages in Ontario particularly weren't growing at the same rate and keeping up with inflation. So it's actually a bit more complex than just not having enough, because we're actually adding more nurses than we are in more people to work in healthcare than we are in other areas of the economy. And though the prices for agency nurses might be high, fully 63.3% of hospital spending is already directed towards compensation. So one of my concerns is about how filling staffing gaps might be crowding out other areas of care or limiting hospitals in how much they might be able to invest in things that could make work better or improve outcomes for patients. So overall, I think it does put hospitals in a bit of a budget crunch, but I don't see it as strictly a shortage issue. I see it as a much more complex change in what we actually consider to be the health sector.
Okay. Charlene, I'm curious, it's not just the province of Ontario. A report last month projected that $1.5 billion will be spent nationwide on agencies, a six-fold increase from pandemic levels. Is this a trend that's going to be moving forward?
Thank you. Well, it appears that it is. And I would argue that the staffing crisis is real. I mean, yes, there's been a lot of hiring over the past year, a lot of incentives to attract nurses into the sector. And I represent primarily registered practical nurses across the country. So the crisis is the same, and the agencies are being relied upon to fill those jobs as well. And there is different levels of dependency. I mean, hospitals is one, but also in long-term care, they're being utilized as well, where, you know, the funding is different, but we don't have the extra resources to be spending on agencies. And this is a critical thing that the country needs to deal with. We have hired more nurses, but when they get into the workforce, because of the working conditions, they don't stay. So, you know, you have to follow the data right to the end. Yes, lots going into colleges, lots of them being hired, but they don't last in the workplaces because of the conditions. So then the employers are relying on agency staff. This has become the attraction for workers because they can choose their hours, they can choose where they work, which also causes an issue because they don't know, they're not familiar with the institutions that they're being placed in, which adds extra pressure to the full-time employees in those facilities. So despite the money that I think we could put back into frontline care to provide better wages so that people stay in the jobs, which would correct the staffing crisis and also the burden of mental health and the care that's provided. So agencies is an epidemic of itself that we need to address. It's become more attractive to work for an agency because of the wages, but you noted only half the wages go to the front line. The other is going to profit. So you've got nurses that are starting up agencies so that they can make more money. So this is a true epidemic that we have to deal with. It makes no sense to be wasting resources on agencies.
Sandra, Lamo had mentioned, you know, staffing agencies are not new. We may have heard more of them in the pandemic, but they were doing their work for decades beyond. I'm just curious, we've seen one particular province, Quebec, that has announced that it is going to be sort of shifting away from agencies. Should staffing agencies be phased out?
Well, certainly, you know, I'm in the education business, so I wouldn't be able to speak for the acute care settings, but agencies have always been there. I worked for an agency as a new grad. So I don't think we can ever phase them out. I think it would not be sustainable for any organization to continue to use agencies with inflated prices. I would question how much of that actually goes to the nurse working and how much goes to the agency. But, you know, so I don't think we can ever phase them out. It is not sustainable in acute care settings to keep relying on them. But we had to during the pandemic. But there are major investments going on to retain nurses in acute care.
I'm curious, I just want to know, you know, when you were working at a staff agency, what were you doing? What type of work were you doing? Was it all across Ontario?
All across Toronto.
Toronto, okay.
All across Toronto. So it was, as a new grad, it was really enjoyable. You could test out different types of hospitals, different settings, and you just got to explore differently than when you were placed as a learner.
All right. We have heard a lot about nursing shortages in the province. Let's look at how many nurses there are in Ontario. In 2023, there were nearly 160,000 employed nurses in Ontario. In that same year, there was a gain of more than 12,000 nurses and a loss of more than 7,000 nurses, resulting in more than 5,000 nurses to the field. Lamo, when you see these figures, what are the first thoughts about the state of the profession?
So I would agree with Rosalie at certain points when Rosalie mentioned that nursing hiring has been on the rise. And I think there's a lot of advocacy work that was put in place right through COVID, before COVID, and even after, where we were advocating for increasing nursing seats across institutions, trying to hire bring in internationally educated nurses and expediting their registration, internationally educated who are already living in Ontario, ready to work. And I think so that led to a lot of increase in hiring of nurses. But I think we also have to compare it to how much are we retaining, because just hiring is never enough. Like, you have expedited internationally educated nurses, but you're not offering a healthy workplace environment. You're not offering safe workloads. You're not offering a mentorship or supportive program or professional development. Nurses also have to take care of themselves. Like, it's a profession which is has a high potential for burnout, and there have been reports after reports, like even the Kai-Hai report that came out not too long ago did mention that there are still a lot of things that we can do. There were 26,000 and nursing jobs that had to be filled, and if you look at Canada-wide, I think Ontario is one of the lowest RN to population ratio. That speaks a lot to, yes, we welcome certain government steps that have been taken to hire more nurses, but are we retaining them? I think we have to also look at the retention strategy and long-term strategies to retain these nursing professionals and not go to agencies or down south.
All right. Rosalie, I'm going to get your take on that. It seems like just looking at those numbers, there's enough nurses in this province, some would say, but hospitals specifically are struggling to keep them. Why are nurses leaving hospitals?
Well, I think maybe instead of thinking about why they're leaving, we can look at why nurses actually choose agencies, because really it's their choice. They can choose where they want to work and how they want to work. And for a survey of sort of the top reasons that nurses choose to work with agencies, the 80% answered things like better pay, more flexibility, the ability to travel and experience different clinical locations. And to me, that kind of goes with maybe earlier career, more likely. And also, I don't think that we should just look at wages alone, because there's also a difference in terms of the benefits packages. You don't have the same security. You don't necessarily have the same health coverage or additional benefits when you work for an agency. So different nurses will, as they take care of themselves and their families, will make different choices about the types of employment they want to have. And maybe I'll add a point that some might find controversial, but if nurses are choosing to leave hospitals to go to agencies, then that means that they find it a better way to work. And so that actually puts a competitive pressure on the hospitals to actually, not pay lip service to retention, but actually do it. Find the pathways that keep the nurses working, prevent burnout, give them the support they need. And there might be other ways to do that, but being an economist first and foremost, competitive pressure is definitely a powerful driver of innovation and improving work standards.
Charlene, I'm coming to you. I'm sure you have a response for that.
Yes, I do. We've surveyed a lot of our nurses, our registered practical nurses, on, why agencies, and the number one answer is wages. And, Rosalie did say that, wages. The other thing, too, is recently, by the government's own admission to the nursing shortage in the province of Ontario, through the Freedom of Information, we got data that they are 13,200 short now, and predict in the next 10 years that'll be tripled. So there'll be 33,000 nurse shortage in the province of Ontario. To me, that raises, alarm bells, flags are raising. We need to deal with this now. And when you ask the people doing the work, not making the money, but doing the work, their number one issue is wages. And and also throughout the sectors. I mean, we need a universal nurse wage rate. You look at home care, they're making $26 an hour. And again, if we're talking about fiscal responsibilities, the system has to be looked at as a whole. People don't want to be in the hospital. They'd rather be taken care of at home, which saves the province money. But when you're paying registered practical nurses $26 an hour in home care and $36 an hour in hospitals, that causes a shortage in home care and long-term care because they are chasing the money. With the cost of living right now, that's what they're after. The benefits and stuff, they're willing to risk that because of the money. And it is wages and then the working conditions. It was mentioned, the nurse to patient ratio. That's a cause of why people are leaving too. They're burning out. I recently had a family member in the hospital and I watched patients apologize to nurses for ringing the call bell because they can see physically how burnt out those nurses are. There's been surgeries canceled because there hasn't been enough nurses for the OR or to receive the patients on the ward. You ask them why. They say it's the working conditions. It's the wages that are not attracting people, which adds to the pressure of the working conditions because nurses are working short.
Sandra, big question here. How do you attract nurses into these settings, in these environments, when clearly what we're hearing is it's a bit lopsided when we look at certain aspects?
I think culture is a really big part of an attraction, and I can speak from the education perspective because we place thousands of students into healthcare environments every year, and that is the introduction that they receive to an opportunity of where they may or may not want to be employed. So it starts there, and the exposure. But we have thousands of students applying to our programs from high school, so it is still a profession that is attracting applicants. But retention is something that begins as they are learners, and students will make decisions about where they want to work early on within their program. But I have to say, there are up to 4 different generations
I was going to say,
in a
is there
hospital setting. And the new graduate is not like the graduate from my generation.
What's different?
Well, I think we have a cohort. Every cohort's different, but now the new generation, they have only known the internet. They've only known the electronic digital world. So they move, they have more than one job, they like to move. I don't think things are the same, and they want different things, and they want to be free, and they want to have quality of life, but they're also not afraid to move around. So I think we have to really ask our newest registered nurses in the profession why they're moving, but I think it's understandable that you could have more than one job, move around at different stages in your life. But
oh, sorry, I was just going to say, can I add on to that a bit too? With the newer cohort also has more options. You can, because there are, there's virtual care provision. After the pandemic, there's been a huge expansion in the private sector wanting their own public health experts or looking at their own internal policies or being able to provide some of these services to their employees directly, as well as vertical integration with some of the insurance companies becoming mixed up in the provider space. And so really it means that even if we're graduating the same number of nurses, maybe a lower proportion of them will actually work for the public system and may actually be employed in areas that we wouldn't actually think are traditionally the health sector. And just
like
one,
what?
Sorry.
Like what?
Well, the explosion in public health in sort of the more government roles, every private sector company had to develop internal policies for infection control and prevention. And so there was essentially jobs almost everywhere that if you were a qualified health professional, you might be qualified for. So you didn't necessarily need to be a licensed nurse, but if someone went to school for that and they have that expertise, they might have more options than what we would consider traditional nursing care. And I would say I see agencies as still being very much delivering care to patients in the public system. And given how strained our hospital system is, it may not be the most desirable solution. It's certainly expensive, not the most efficient, but it does provide an avenue to getting people into the hospital to potentially lessen that burden, because if the alternative is no one is there, then that is really the worst outcome. And I think we need to be realistic about the fact that we had over 200 temporary emergency room closures in Ontario last year. And so if agencies are filling that gap, it might be expensive, it might not be ideal, but it's better than the worst outcome of patients not being able to access the emergency department if they need it.
All right. Lalma, if you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'm just saying, like, I want to disagree on that a little bit, because I think using agency nurses cannot be justified, to be honest, because I think we are doing disservice to Ontarians. And I understand when you're saying there's no one to give and therefore agencies are there to fill the gaps. But we have to understand that people who run the agencies are business people. These are not nurses. These are not healthcare professionals. They do not have that the sensitivity lens. It's all about a business model. So we utilizing agency nurses to in areas like metropolitan areas or where there's a lot of resource is doing disservice to Ontarians. Having said that, there's some use in Northern Ontario's, like my friends have been used as agency nurses to work up north because there's no one. But then that is why the government has to look at incentives for remote nursing, northern nursing. What are we doing? Like students in Laurentian and up north, maybe we should give them an incentive loan forgiveness to stay up there. Maybe we should build capacity among the Indigenous nurses up there so that they can be utilized to work in their own community, because that's an intrinsic motivation. So using an agency nurses can never be justified because it compromises the continuity of care, the excellence of care, and there's no accountability. Having said that, nurses are not to be blamed. It's the beast that we have created because we did not address the nursing crisis.
All right, Charlene, I'm going to get you in on that as well.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, agencies, it just doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, the numbers that you quoted at the beginning of the show, you could hire 2 nurses for what you're paying an agency to provide you with 1. And yes, the continuity of care, I mean, that's important. And also the familiarization of the institute. The nurses who are still working inside the hospital say that it's added pressure to them to orientate an agency nurse into the facility. The patient, I mean, it adds stress when a nurse, a full-time nurse in a hospital or registered practical nurse is asked to go from one floor to the other. The orientation is needed for safe care, and that's at risk right now. The safe care is at risk because of the staffing shortage, which is caused by not giving them adequate wages. I mean, common sense is, why wouldn't you take the agency money that you're paying twice the amount for, hire twice the staff in a full-time facility, and have that continuity of care there for the services and for the patient? It makes no sense. Agencies and the government is the one that has to deal with this because it is exploding. People are making money off of the agencies, which is what was said. And you've got workers going there because of the fact that there is some flexibility in work. This is not going to, it still hasn't addressed the crisis in the hospitals, because you can ask anyone today, if you're working side by side with an agency, is it helping the staffing shortage? And it's no. And the patient ratios are still at a critical risk for the patients, even with the use of agency workers. So profit in healthcare shouldn't be allowed. They should be put in the front line so that the working conditions are safer. If you've got enough staff, that provides you with safe working conditions because there's enough people doing the work. We haven't even started talking about the mental health crisis that's happening in healthcare too, because of the workload and their lack of ability to give the patient care that they went to school to provide, because they go home at night crying, they're in their cars crying because they weren't able to give the patient the care that they wanted to provide to them.
All right. Let's talk retention. There's a few mentions of retention, what we can do. Sandra, a recent report from the Montreal Economic Institute showed that for every 100 young nurses, 35 are leaving the professional in general, whether it's from hospital to agency, just in general. What can we be doing about this?
Well, there isn't one solution. Retention is now something our Chief Federal Nurse Lee Chapman has created a retention toolkit that many of our acute care organizations are utilizing. But it's multifactorial because I think we really have to know why people are moving and leaving, because I think there are more opportunities now. So not everybody's leaving the profession per se, but they are moving around. But I think you have to prepare them for the workforce. And so that's part of what we do at McMaster when we graduate our BSENs. We do prepare them by immersing them in practical learning with clinical placements so that they are prepared and they do get experience in clinical so that they're aware of what practice looks like as a full-time nurse. I mean, then students can make their choices from there. But I would like to follow those numbers to see if they are sustained. It has been a difficult time for the last 4 years, so things have to get better. There will always be vacancies in hospitals. There have always been vacancies in hospitals, and the pandemic has really just blown it up.
Momo, I'm going to give you the last word on this in terms of retention. You mentioned some of the stuff, but what needs to be done to keep nurses?
Yeah, I just want to draw your attention to RNAO's work, Registered Nurses Association advocacy work that has been happening for some time on nursing retention and nursing crisis. I think we have addressed various topics on this because we have to look at it upstream. And when I say upstream, I think hospitals are always the end goal. It's a downstream strategy. Yes, we are focusing on hospitals, but addressing nursing shortage in hospital is very downstream. We need to look at why nurses are burnt out, why nurses are having unsafe workloads. Yes, they have to be compensated, and there has to be fair compensation and wage parity across different sectors. And as Charlene mentioned, communities are paid less, and that's why they don't want to stay in communities. But having said that, if community nurses are not there, these patients who are supposed to be in community are going to flood our EDs and are going to put nurses in precarious work conditions. If I had to say something about retention, I think we need to address the primary care crisis that's happening right now, utilize all hands on board, including nurse practitioners to fill the gaps in primary care crisis so that these patients do not flood EDs, also providing a healthy workplace environment and wage parity across all sectors, I think is a good strategy with healthy workplace.
All right, we are going to have to leave it there. Lamo, Charlene, Sandra, Rosalie, thank you so much. A very important conversation. One that won't be solved today, but one that we will continue to follow. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Marc Garneau has made history twice. As the first Canadian to fly to outer space and as the first astronaut elected to the House of Commons. What does this former cabinet minister and space traveler think of that journey? Well, he tells it all. In his new book, it's called A Most Extraordinary Ride: Space, Politics, and the Pursuit of a Canadian Dream. And Marc Garneau joins us now here in the studio for more. It's great to have you in that chair.
Great to be with you, Steve.
Pleasure. You joined the Navy at age 16. In part, I gather, as you tell us in the book, because you spent a night in jail. You want to tell that story a little bit?
Well, I was a bit of a rebellious kid, and when I was just turning 16, I was out drinking with some friends, and I got drunk. And unfortunately, when we left the tavern and went down the street, my friend said, "Watch this." And there was an open trunk on a car, and he stole something out of the back. And just at that time, the owner came back, and he said, "Hey, hey." And I scattered, and he scattered. And about 15 minutes later, I was picked up by the police, and they took me to jail and put me in a cell and called my parents. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, my dad came to get me and took me home. And
I'll bet he was thrilled.
Boy, oh boy, he was, I have to say I was very proud of the way he dealt with it. He was very quiet for 20 minutes. I had sobered up by then, and then he said, "What happened?" And on the drive back home, and I explained it to him, and he said, "Look, we'll talk in the morning. You look very tired." And I was exhausted. But that was a turning point in my life.
Yeah, what was the takeaway?
The takeaway was that I was young, immature, did some stupid things, and it was time to get my life in order. And very shortly after that, I went down to the recruiting center in Quebec City and joined the Navy.
It's interesting that you did not necessarily set out from childhood to be an astronaut, and you certainly did not have dreams of being a politician, and yet you did both of those things. Is it fair to say you've led a kind of accidental life in a way?
Yes, sometimes I feel a little bit like Forrest Gump. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, but those were not childhood dreams.
Let's move to politics. You've had quite a journey in politics. You decide to run for Paul Martin's Liberals just as they are about to go into the tank.
Yes.
Great timing. You lose by 9,000 votes, but you are one of many people who had a great political career despite having lost the first time out. But I do have to ask, why did you decide to run in that election when the Liberals' prospects seem so bleak? This is 2006, right?
Yes.
The one that Mr. Martin lost to Stephen Harper.
Yes.
So why go then?
Well, in the vernacular, my timing sucked very badly. I thought that it was my one opportunity, perhaps, to do something that I'd always thought about, and I didn't think about the fact that Canadians were tired of the Liberals after almost 12 years. The sponsorship scandal was a very big issue in Quebec. I didn't think about those considerations. I just sort of charged into it and of course lost convincingly the first time, but learned some important lessons. And because I don't like to lose, I said, I'm going to hang in there and perhaps I'll be luckier next time, which I was.
And you were. You won the next time. And then, Sheldon, let's bring this picture up if we can, because in the 2013 Liberal leadership race, you were a contestant, as was the guy who eventually won, Justin Trudeau. There, the two of you are in that picture there at the convention. And you asked him what turned out to be a pretty devastating question during the course of that campaign, which is what made him think he had the qualifications to be the leader of this party, given that he had, let's be blunt, he had a fairly thin resume at that point. How much do you think asking him that question in that campaign affected your future relationship with him?
It's a very good question. I've asked that. You know, when you have a leadership race within the same party, you realize that you're all competing against each other. Somebody's going to win, and you hope you're all going to work together afterwards in a harmonious way. So you don't want to cross certain lines. And I agonized over the question that I was asking him, but I thought ultimately it's a fair question to ask. I don't think that he held it against me, at least I hope he didn't, because when we finally were elected in 2015, he made me his transport minister. So I have to think he looked beyond that particular issue that day.
Well, here's where I come back with, yes, but you were his transport minister, but you didn't have any kind of relationship with him, right? I mean, you never met with him, you never had, well, you tell the story.
Well, you know, we're 23 years apart in age. I was not one of his childhood friends. I don't think you need to have a very strong personal relationship with your boss, whether it's in politics or any other area. You do have to have a trust in each other, and you have to be competent in doing the job that you're doing. But, you know, in the end, I have to say that in the 6 years that I was a minister, our relationship was not one of the close relationships. He didn't sort of call me and ask me what my thoughts were about this or that, or invite me to his house or anything like that.
Did it make you feel any better that he treated all those other ministers the same way, apparently?
Well, I think most were in the same boat as me. He did have some very close friends. I think some ministers could knock on his door any day of the week and talk to him, but those tended to be people he had known even before life in politics. They were almost childhood friends.
January 2021, you get shuffled in the cabinet to Foreign Affairs. Great job. But you're the fourth minister in 5 years to have it. And here's what you have to say about that. Sheldon, graphic, please. My new responsibilities did not bring us closer. In fact, I was called only once, and that was to discuss the status of the two Michaels imprisoned in China. And it was in a boardroom with various other people from the PMO and the Privy Council office in preparation for a meeting with our ambassador to China, Dominic Barton. The Prime Minister's aloofness led me to conclude that he did not consider my advice useful enough to want to hear from me directly, relying instead on his staff. I found this disappointing, to say the least. The expectation was that communications between him and me would be via the PMO, and so consequently, I never knew what information, if any, reached him. So many things to pick up on here. Well, let's start with this. You had to call the two Michaels families, right, as minister?
Yes, I did.
What was that call like?
Very, very painful and very necessary, of course. And so I was talking to the families, including the parents, and it was tough because what I was telling them was that we're making progress. I know it's gone on for a very long time, and they were always invariably polite with me, but I think they were skeptical because they weren't seeing anything happening. And by this time, they had been in jail for over 2 years. And you could tell how, and particularly the parent side of things, because these were people who were very senior in their years, and there was almost a sense that we may never see our sons again. And so one of the tough parts of being a foreign minister in a situation like that, and but I kept telling them, we are going to make this successful, and please don't ever think that we're dropping the ball here. And I was just so pleased that before the end of my term, we were able to bring them back.
But I'm also inferring from this quote here that you had hoped that being foreign minister, which is a very senior portfolio, might give you an opportunity for a closer, more meaningful relationship with the Prime Minister, which again did not happen. Disappointing again?
Yes, I was disappointed. I've lived 17 years of my life abroad. I've lived in Europe for 8 years of my life. I've lived in the United States for 9 years of my life. I have always been a student of international affairs. I feel that I was the Prime Minister's critic for foreign affairs for 2 years when we were in opposition. And I just felt that there was not ever a request on his part to tell me, what do you think of this, Mark?
Well, after the third Liberal election victory, sorry to bring this up, but you wrote about it. Here we go. Last excerpt from the book, please. Marc Garneau gets dropped from cabinet. And here's what he writes. It felt like a punch in the gut. There's no other way to put it. I had been dismissed. Saying I was disappointed does not convey the intensity of my emotions at that moment. I felt totally blindsided and didn't know what to think. Had I done something wrong? And if so, what? Was I taking the fall for Canada's response in Afghanistan? Or was it simply poor chemistry between me and the Prime Minister? Only he can answer that question, and he chose not to do so. The PM does not owe me an explanation, and I felt it was inappropriate for me to ask him why. I will say that none of the speculative reasons offered by friends and colleagues were related to my competence, nor was I ever disloyal to him. Okay, this is the point where I'm reading the book and I'm screaming at the book because he didn't offer an explanation and you didn't ask him for one?
Well, people have remarked on this just like you just did, Steve. And, imagine yourself in this scenario. You're me and I'm the Prime Minister, and I'm telling you that you're out of cabinet. How appropriate do you think as an individual it would be, why are you taking me out of cabinet?
I wouldn't put
Somehow,
it that way, but I'd say, is it something I said? Is it something I did? It'd be useful for me to know if I, didn't meet your expectations or what. You didn't do that?
I didn't. Maybe I was caught so badly off guard that I was left tongue-tied and totally. It was a punch in the gut. He said, I want to, his office said, the Prime Minister wants to talk to you at, I don't know, 5 o'clock, and I was not expecting that. I mean, I had run in the election, been re-elected 3 weeks before, so I thought, well, I hopefully will continue in my job because there are a lot of things that I wanted to do in foreign affairs. Having been there for, at that point, about 7 or 8 months, there were many, many things that I wanted to do. So it was the last thing I was expecting, and it came as a real shocker.
Would you have run again had you known you were going to be dropped from cabinet?
No, I would not have. And in fact, there has been a tradition in the past that sometimes incumbent leaders, prime ministers, do a round of their cabinet ministers many months before a possible election, say, are you intending to run again? Because, in that case, they sometimes will do a small shuffle, bring in some new people to give them a few months in their new portfolios before the election is called. he didn't come to me and say before the election, Mark, I intend to switch after this. I went into the election, even though I told my family that this was going to be my last election. But because he had appointed me 7 months before to be the foreign minister, and I had become seized with the issues that I wanted to work on for a longer term, I basically begged my wife, could I run one more time? And she said, well, okay, I understand. But had I been told point blank, no, I'm going to switch you, I would not have run in that last election.
You've had 3 years to think about why he did it. Mm-hmm. What explanations do you come up with?
I don't know. I really don't. I'm not trying to be evasive or cute here. I do not know why. I mean, there are half a dozen I can speculate on, but I'm not going to speculate on any of them because I really don't know the truth, and the one I might offer you might be wrong.
Have you spoken to him at all since then?
I have not.
Really?
On the day that I left, and I was offered the opportunity to make a small speech in the House of Commons where I enjoined my fellow MPs on both sides of the aisle to be more civil with each other.
Mm-hmm. How's that going?
Not very well. It seems a lesson that has to be relearned about once a week. Mm-hmm. He did come up to me, and then, as just about everybody in the House of Commons came up to me and shook my hand. He did come up and shake my hand, but I had very little to do with him after I was removed from cabinet. And and I also want to add this. I wasn't sure what he offered me an ambassadorship when he took me out. He offered me to be the ambassador in Paris, which I love Paris and it's a lovely city. I just didn't feel it was appropriate 3 weeks after being reelected to say to my constituents, sorry, I'm leaving. So I stayed on. And I have to say the last year and a half, even though I was a backbencher, first as the chair of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs, something I was interested in, and then later as the co-chair of the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying, turned out to be very, very satisfying. So when I did leave in March of 2023, I felt really good about the 15 years that I'd been there, and I left with absolutely no regrets.
And just finally, as you look back, and your life's obviously not over yet, a long way from over, you still got stuff you want to do, but how do you make sense of the whole thing? A life of such extraordinary highs and such extraordinary lows.
Yeah, no, when I decided to write the book, and after I'd written it, I really, this may sound disingenuous, but I was honestly shocked at the realization of how much I had done in the last 40 years. And how did it happen that way? I didn't plan it that way. Most people can't plan their life in a reliable fashion anyway. But I think it was my attitude. First of all, as soon as I was born, I was a curious person, and I wanted to go out there and grab life, and made some stupid mistakes in my slightly rebellious childhood, but I learned from those. And what stayed with me was that I had met enough people who had retired after their careers and said, "I wish I'd done this." And that's a surprisingly common refrain from many people. They say, I played it too safe. I did have some dreams back then, and I didn't try to make them come true. And I've had dreams all my life, and some of them I've failed in, but some of them I've succeeded in. And so that's my lesson to people, and particularly to young people, is, don't be shy about trying. And failure's not that big a deal. You learn a lot, you pick yourself up, and you go forward.
Great advice from Canada's first man in space, Marc Garneau. A most extraordinary ride, space, politics, and the pursuit of a Canadian dream, which he has lived. Monsieur Garneau, a great pleasure to have you here in our studio today. Come back again.
Thank you very much, Steve.
We have a new series we want to tell you about here at TVO. It's called Forgotten War. We know our World War II history, and for good reason. But what about after 1945? From Korea to Cyprus to Bosnia and Croatia, Each week until Remembrance Day, we will share the stories of Canadian veterans who served in one of these lesser-known conflicts. Forgotten War was produced by Sean Edgerton Foreman and Eric Bombacino in partnership with Canada Company. They're a nonpartisan charity devoted to supporting Canadian Armed Forces members, veterans, and their families. And we thank them for their support. Our first episode is about the Korean War.
War is not what you see on TV. It's not the games you play. You play the games, your hero gets killed, he's come back in another game. You get killed, you don't come back.
This is Romeo Daly. In 1950, at the age of 18, he volunteered to fight in the Korean War with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry.
All wars, the people that suffer the most are the kids and the women. When I first landed in Korea, I had never seen anything like this. People next to no clothing, no food, begging. We were having a luncheon, and there was 3 kids along the fence. There was one there, he would stay there every day with his hand out. And one of us would give him a can of maybe spaghetti and meatballs or beans or whatever, and he'd take it and run. He went to an area where there was about 12 other kids, and with a rock he was trying to break it open. And when he did, he would pass it along to all the other kids to eat. And that's when we realized that we've got to do something, to do whatever we could to help these people.
In 1945, Korea was split into 2 along the 38th parallel between the United States and the Soviet Union. On June 25, 1950, shortly after Soviet and American troops withdrew, Communist North Korea invaded the South. Within months, United Nations troops were squeezed into a small area in the southeast. It was the first military action of the Cold War. The UN then counterattacked, pushing North Korean forces back into their own territory. But this prompted China to intervene, and UN troops were forced to retreat in disarray back beyond the 38th parallel. When Daly arrived in the summer of 1951, the war had reached a bloody stalemate, with both sides dug in near the pre-war border.
Korea was a lot like the First World War insofar it was basically all trench warfare, mostly defending ourselves compared to the Second World War where we were the aggressors. In Korea, we were the defenders of the Republic of Korea.
Soon after arriving, Daly and his men were a part of Operation Pepperpot. His company was instructed to clear and take Hill 156. Initially, they encountered little resistance, but that didn't last for long.
With the Bren gun, I had 2 men filling the magazines. The Chinese were coming so fast and so thick. The only way to describe it is, did you ever kick an anthill? And you see how fast the ants come out? That's the way they came.
5 Canadian soldiers were killed and 21 wounded. Daly and his men, after completing their mission, withdrew early in the afternoon under the cover of a smokescreen.
Fear was not there. It was, you do what you have to do.
Although peace talks began that summer and stretched into the autumn, intense fighting continued in the hilly terrain near the 38th parallel. And the danger to Daly and his company didn't just come from the enemy.
And we were coming back through Royal Canadian Regiment lines. And we were getting pretty close to their line when our sergeant said, "Stop, we're in the middle of a minefield." So we all stopped. We got our radio man, contacted the RCR. They sent an engineer down. His name was Roy Reed, sergeant engineer. He come down and he had laid the minefield. He knew where every mine was. and he walked each one of us out one by one. You step here, you step there, you step here, you step there. Took us out. Now, to add to the story, when I came home from Korea and I was working on Canada Customs, we had a package that had suspected explosives in it. So we called Niagara Regional Police. Niagara Regional Policeman came down, did what he had to do. He looked at me, I looked at him. He asked me my name. He didn't know who I was, but I knew who he was. And he says, Roy Reed, Sergeant with the Niagara Regional Police Explosives Division. I said, Romeo Daly, Princess Patricius, you walked me out of a minefield. He got the military medal for what he did, and we renewed our friendship until he died in 2002.
While out in no man's land, Daly and his men ran into a Chinese patrol. They engaged and fired, pushing them back. But an enemy soldier was able to get close.
We had just come back from a patrol and we were lining up and the Chinese were countering. They out-patrolled us, really, because we would have maybe 12 men out and they would have 30 or 40. And they all had machine guns. They had a gun called a burp gun that could shoot 70 rounds a minute. We had a 303 that shot one. A hand grenade exploded in my forefront, and it took my right ear just about off, hit me in the forehead here, and hit me down here.
Daly was put into a helicopter and rushed to a hospital.
Took me to a place in Weejambu. They kept me there for about 3 days, sewed my ear back on, patched me all up, did a little plastic surgery, and the one doctor says, you look pretty good, Johnny. We were Johnny Canucks. You look pretty good, Johnny. He says, they won't see them scars for about 60, 70, maybe 80 years. And that's about it when they're starting to come out.
Most American soldiers in Korea were drafted. The American nurses at MASH were dumbfounded when they learned Daly, like every other Canadian in the war, had volunteered.
Well, crazy Canuck, you volunteered for this? You deserve every damn thing you get. Yeah, but I gave a lot too. I like to think I gave more than what I got.
On July 27, 1953, the military commanders from the United Nations, North Korea, and China signed an armistice agreement.
Why didn't they sign a peace treaty? I don't know. I can't answer it. I don't know why. But when I heard that the fighting had stopped, I just put my hands together and said thank you to whoever. Thank you.
After serving more than a year in Korea, mostly as a teenager, Daly came home.
When I came home, got on a train in BC, went to Toronto where my mother lived. When I got to Union Station in Toronto and I got off the train, hit the platform, there was my mother. No military, nothing. The Canadian government did not treat us well. We wanted a volunteer medal for Korea. Canadian government says no. We said, you've got thousands of volunteer medals in Ottawa from the Second World War. Can't give them to you. Why not? That'll insult the Second World War soldiers.
Even in the Legions, shoulder to shoulder with fellow veterans, including many from World War II, Daly says his war was not taken seriously.
1992, they came out with a Canadian Volunteer Service Medal for Korea, and that's the second one there. I got it in the mail. We all got it in the mail. I fought for years to get a pension. Now, I came back from Korea in 1952. I got out in 1957. In 2007, they finally gave me a pension. It's an absolute insult.
There is, however, one government Daly does feel appreciation from: South Korea's.
I was absolutely honored when I went back in 1980. The one dinner that they sponsored for us, King and Queen couldn't have been any better.
The Korean War technically has never ended. The armistice has held for the last 71 years. Today, North and South Korea are separated by a 250-kilometer long, 4-kilometer wide, demilitarized zone, roughly following the pre-war border.
If I was capable and able, I would do it again. I knew what I had to do, and I did it.
Today, South Korea is ranked 19th in the world by the UN's Human Development Index, ahead of countries such as France, Japan, and the United States.
If the communists had taken Korea, look at your map and your proximity. Where would we be today?
Almost 27,000 Canadians served in Korea during the war. 516 died. More than any other conflict in Canadian history, except for the First and Second World Wars.
It was not a forgotten war. It's a forgotten victory. I had a hand in changing history. Although I like to say I'm just a dumb farm boy, what do I know? Eh? But you know what we say on the farm, eh? Don't kick the mule. He'll kick you back.
This video was made possible by the generous donation of Canada Company.
That is the agenda for Thursday, October 17th, 2024. Tomorrow, Steve Paikin and John Michael McGrath will return with a new episode of On Poly, where they'll discuss the Ford government's involvement in the Great Bike Lane debate. I'm Jan Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and Steve and John Michael will see you again tomorrow.